Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first asynchronous video lecture. I suppose it would be asynchronous if it is a video lecture, right? But anyway, welcome to our first video lecture for the semester. I understand that many people do learn better face to face, but just because of the circumstances, it's nice to explore having a video lecture where you can return to the things that I say. And I do understand that I tend to say a lot of things in the context of one session. So hopefully, this will help toward that end. So, in our last sessions, we talked about the Renaissance, specifically the Italian Renaissance, right? And I tried to contextualize this in an introductory way, right? How the wealth generated by the Mediterranean trade led to the development of art and culture in Italian city states, and how the people there sort of took heavy inspiration from classical antiquity. Now, um, as a as like a starting point to today's lecture, I also kind of want to say that our lessons do tend to be introductory, just because we have a lot of material to cover. But if there's any specific topic that you want to learn more about and you need a bit of guidance, I can definitely send you resources. So just send me an email and I'll look for something that's related to your query or your interest, and that can get you started, right? Especially if you're interested in learning about that for a final project. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the Northern Renaissance. I've briefly introduced this before through the maps that we've tackled together, right? If you need a quick and easy introduction, you can watch the Crash Course European History episode on the Northern Renaissance. Of course, this is not required, but it does give you a bird's eye view of what was happening. But for us who are following this present lecture, I want to show us I want us to explore an image of the world that we are about to enter. Now, on the screen, you will find two images. Firstly, a woodcut of Nuremberg, right? And Nuremberg was one of the most important sites of the Northern Renaissance. And it was, part of other cities in the Hanseatic League, which we will discuss in a couple of slides. But look at it, right? When we think about trading cities of this era, I want you to imagine almost a fort, right? A fort that would serve as a primary trading zone. So this form of imagery might not be very um, alien to us, actually, if you like to watch uh series like Game of Thrones, or I know there's a new spin-off now and I've completely forgotten what it was called, but I remember the little kid, like Aegon, right? His nickname is Egg. So that looks interesting. Um I've also been recently following the new episodes of Freyren, right? And every time there's a new city that they enter, it tends to be structured that way. So just imagine, this is where a lot of the developments are happening. Now, onto the side here is this guy called Albert Dürer. And Albert Dürer was a very, mm, I suppose, important example of what a Renaissance man looked like in Northern Europe. Now, this is a painting of him, and you'll notice that unlike the bright, deep, rich colors of the Italian Renaissance, Northern Renaissance painters tended to have moodier moodier lighting. So parang there are also differences in the kinds of art that mm, they would create. Uh, but we can talk about that now, no? So what I want us to remember is that although the Renaissance here in Italy happened, or it inspired, I guess, the Renaissance here, they had key differences, right? So if classical antiquity was an inspiration for the Italian Renaissance, for the Northern Renaissance, which was in sort of like uh, Holy Roman territory, I suppose you could say. Not exactly, pero andun siya sa northern part na yun. Because of this geographic context, they were a lot more inspired by Christian imagery and Christian conversations. Kaya yung art nila also reflects that, which we'll see in a little bit now. So let's describe the Northern Renaissance first. First, trade in the Northern Renaissance zones was like it took place within these areas. So what we'll call the Netherlands in the present day, Prussia. Also, interestingly, parts of the or Baltic Sea, I think. So ito yung mga integrated dyan. So it's a very different world, like culturally, from the Mediterranean. So the biggest, or I guess the most important space of historical development to emerge in the Northern Renaissance would be the Netherlands. So it was not the Netherlands yet. In fact, it wasn't even a country yet. It wasn't the Dutch Republic. It was just a series of cities that will eventually fight for their own independence. But for now, they're Dutch cities. So together, many of the cities in this space created the Hanseatic League, which I've sort of mentioned before. But in very simple terms, it was an alliance between merchant cities in the northern Holy Roman Empire or present-day Germany. So, yan sila. Okay. So, in the 13th century, which is when these trading networks begin to emerge, no? The North German coastal towns formed a commercial and military association known as the Hansa, or the Hanseatic League. By 1500, more than 80 cities belonged to the League, which had established settlements and commercial bases in many cities in England and Northern Europe. Now, I want us to pay attention to the fact that it was both a commercial and military association, because it was not possible for you to travel with expensive items, with trade items at this time, without the support of a larger fleet that would protect you. So, we're not just talking about traders, we're talking about traders who have to navigate the quite violent environment of the early modern period. So, because they had, of course, they had the fleet, but some of them also traveled by land, they created a network to spread Renaissance culture across Northern Europe. Now, some of the ideas that they brought with them came from Italy because they did have trade links there. But the questions that they asked had more to do with how to revive Christianity, right? And one of the people who emerged in this environment was Decidius Erasmus. Now, Decidius Erasmus was a intellectual of his time, and using these networks, these trade networks, he sent hundreds, thousands potentially of letters to colleagues and peers in different parts of Europe. So while you have the expansion of trade networks, you also have the um, expansion of intellectual networks where people like him are asking, how do we revive Christianity so it's closer to the everyday believer? So yun na nga, it was also an intellectual and artistic movement. So it wanted to interpret classical Christian work. Now, within that uh movement, I guess, within this universe of questions, one of the most critical areas of conversation were religious calls for reform. So Erasmus and this other guy who was from England, his name was Thomas More, will later influence the Reformation. But for now, they sort of lay the groundwork for the types of questions that later reformists like Luther will ask. For example, Erasmus called for a wider dissemination of Christian work through vernacular languages and a return to piety over outward rituals. So, this is also the time of the printing press, you have to remember. So, the printing press creates an environment that creates a technology that actually allows you not just to print something out and share it to two, three, four cities, um, probably within like a month. It also gives you the opportunity to print in a local language, right? And so that means a parish somewhere further away that is not speaking Latin can have a copy of biblical texts and other doctrinal work in their own language, and then the priests or whoever can read that to their parishioners. And so this was a concept that Erasmus was championing because he noticed that Christianity was more and more a performance of ritual rather than a deep connection between believer and the church or God, I suppose. Now, at the same time, you see wars to expand territories, especially in Spain and France, right? And so I know there's a lot of wars happening at the time, but the reason I introduced some of these is because the conflict that emerges also generates the tension that eventually leads to new territories. For instance, nung nagka-war nga between Spain and France, yung product nun ay yung Dutch Republic. And if we look at the earlier slide, no, the Hanseatic League was basically like a lot of its major cities were in the Dutch Republic, what will later become the Netherlands. So, quick geographic review lang. Spain is down here and France is here. Now the question is, why are they warring over the territories of the Netherlands? There's a long history here. Pero yung TLDR natin ay, for some time, the Holy Roman Empire actually included Spain kasi related yung monarchs nila. And the monarchs in Spain had claims to Dutch territories as part of their own territories. So parang part siya nung kung ano yung imamana dapat nila. But because of the wars with France, and because the merchant fleets were not just merchant fleets, they were also military fleets. Some of these cities here decided that later on they were going to become independent entirely. So yun. Bakit related dun yung calls for religious freedom? Because the Dutch Republic would actually use Protestantism as one of its claims for its own separate nation. We'll talk about that more later. Basta yung point dito ay Christian ideals have a very, very big impact on beliefs, experimental ideas, and also outcomes. Okay. Now let's talk about the artistic movement for a little bit, right? This is a 15th century painting called The Descent from the Cross. And I want you to notice how it is a Renaissance painting, but the theme is very specifically Christian. It's not about the Roman gods and goddesses, it's not about Aphrodite, right? Or any other Greek or Roman influence. It's really Christian in nature, no? Kasi nga, yun yung ano nila, zeitgeist, or zeitgeist means the moment, right? The cultural moment that they were having was to really rethink Christianity from visual arts to the way they were writing about it to how they were spreading the word, no? And this sets the tone later for the Reformation. So, this is a very quick and easy introduction to the Northern Renaissance. In the next slides, we'll talk about the transition to the Reformation. Okay, hello again. Here we're going to talk about the Reformation. So, previously, we looked at the groundwork that was laid in the north of Europe, especially in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, diba? Because that's where a lot of the most important Hanseatic cities were. Now, here we shift our focus to the larger space of the Holy Roman Empire and begin to trace the emergence of the Protestant Reformation or Protestant Revolution. So we start in Germany, we look at its spread, and we look at the major, uh, at not just attacks, the major Catholic counter interpretations, which was called the Counter Reformation. Tapos titignan din natin yung religious wars that follow from them. Okay, so quick introduction. If you need, once again, a quick and easy bird's eye view, I would encourage you to go check out the Crash Course European History videos for this. Not required, but helpful. Now the question is, why do we need to study the Reformation, right? And Scott Dixon, who is one of my key authors that I used for the lecture, says, during the Protestant Reformation, Christianity was fundamentally and irrevocably transformed. He says this is without doubt the most dramatic development of the early modern period because it was profoundly creative and destructive at the same time. The Reformation put an end to the late medieval Catholic synthesis and replaced it with a synthesis of its own, ultimately reshaping the relationship between the believer and the divine. Now, how do we unpack this, right? Firstly, I have to say, we didn't spend a lot of time looking at what happened within Christian belief during the medieval era, just because I thought it would be a little too dense for an introductory course. For those of you who are philosophy minors, there's an entire course dedicated just to understanding this, no? But our TLDR sort of summary for this is the within Western Europe, the key institutions, religious institutions to survive were, of course, patches of parishes, but also the monasteries and universities that would emerge. And within these spaces, they would heatedly debate Catholic beliefs, like what is proper doctrine, um, what kinds of rituals or practices should we follow. And we're talking about really, really deep theological debates happening. For instance, Aquinas and Saint Augustine are people you might associate to that era. So when Dixon talks about the Catholic synthesis that emerged in the medieval era, he's talking about this almost not entirely unified, no, kasi may nagde-debate pa rin. But he talks about this parang more or less stable level of knowledge that people had about Catholic Christian belief. So they were studying text a lot, right? They were studying the Bible and the supporting texts within the Roman Catholic canon. And they were interpreting what is purgatory, what does it mean to go to heaven, how do you get there, um, what does it mean for there to be a Father, Son, Holy Spirit, ano ba yung grounding doon within the texts that they're reading. So we don't need to get into it too much, no, but for theological debates, the medieval period was not a dark age. It was one of intense scrutiny and intellectual development, right? In fact, one of the key texts that a lot of more traditional believers still use today, which is the St. James Bible, emerges in that context. Kaso, pagdating ng Protestant Reformation, ito-challenge na yung stable beliefs na na-produce nung medieval period by, just calling into question the very things it talks about, like what sorts of rituals are we supposed to participate in? What sacraments are actually holy, and which among them are just, performances essentially that have been integrated into Christian belief, even if they don't really have real grounding. What kinds of books are we supposed to use when we're unpacking Christian belief? Do we include things that are not in the Bible? And that was a very, very big point of debate, no? Um, Kaya sabi ng ibang Protestant believers, if it's not in the Bible, then we don't believe in it. Diba? So, ganun. You see what I'm getting at here? There were questions that targeted the unity of belief that eventually lead to different interpretations. And these interpretations become branches of the Reformation. So, yun na nga. There's a shift away from Latin Christianity as a unifying force across Western and Central Europe. We saw how in the medieval era, Christianity definitely created a common societal model. But now, the Protestant splits raise questions about religious and political sovereignty that then leads to state warfare across Europe, right? So now, instead of Christianity being a unifying force, it actually becomes a way to split loyalties. There are full blown wars that are fought mostly about mostly because of having the right to believe in your own religion, right? From the level of like state leaders. We'll talk about that more later. And this is an important period for Europe because it reshapes the political landscape quite literally. So, for instance, two of the treaties that set the groundwork for the present day international state system are the Treaty of Augsburg in 1555 and the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. 48 dapat yan. My apologies. So for us to understand this evolving world, we have to look at, beginnings, its spread, and reactions against it.